Thanks very much, and thanks very much to ODI for organising this, and to all of you for coming. I know some of you reasonably well. There's lots of you I don't know, which is great, because it shows, as Lisa said, there's quite a wide community of people, which I hope we can bring together over the course of the seminar series. As Lisa says, although from the point of view the seminar series is the first one, I don't feel it is, because I know ODI has had a whole stream of work on this over the last couple of years, both looking at politics and development more generally, and S&J. So I certainly see this as part of continuation of the stream. And what I've tried to do, given this is sort of the first talk in the series, is to set a little bit of the context, raise some of the issues I think be worth discussing both now and possibly over the seminar series, but then quickly move away from some of that contextual discussion into some practical ideas of what could actually be done. And then I'll end with some recommendations that we can hopefully debate. I've probably put too much in the slides, so the great thing is they're available afterwards, so I'll rattle through certain points. You can always come back to me afterwards by email or phone if you need to on these issues. And just the other point I suppose I'd make in terms of my own personal experience, obviously this is drawn partly from my own experience, my research, and my practical work. As many of you know, a lot of my personal experience has been, I suppose, Middle East, South Asia, rather than Sub-Saharan Africa. Many of you I know work much more in Sub-Saharan Africa, and so it'll be very interesting to look at some of the overlaps or disconnects between those two parts of the world as well, just as a word. All right. I don't know how well these screens work, but I'm told you can all see them at some point. But I'll just make the point that to start off with, as Lisa said, I think we as academics, practitioners, policymakers, whatever we are, all agree vigorously, because we've had lots of seminars and papers on this now, that security and justice programs can't be purely technical. They need to be political, as with development as a whole. But we also know that injecting real political approaches has been quite hard. Some examples I would suggest is that if you look at the work where people have tried to do this, doing political economy analysis, conflict analyses, in other words, using some of those analytical tools, frankly, I think quite often these have been add-ons. They haven't really impacted on policymaking and programming in this area. So even if we've got the theory of how to do this, we haven't actually done it very much. Similarly, I'll come back to demand and supply side. There's been quite a lot of work over the last few years to tie together demand and supply side approaches to security and justice programming, as with other types of programming, such as budget reform. Again, I'll suggest often they're quite disconnected. So the theory of what should be done, I think, is there. It's been difficult to actually deliver and do this in practice, which we'll talk a little bit about. So what I want to do is explore now some very practical ways where political approaches can be effectively incorporated. So to summarize, the thesis is, hopefully you're all familiar with this and hopefully you're all agreed with this. If not, it'd be quite useful to question some of the fundamentals when we come back to this. But this is, I would say, the starting point for a lot of the debate in this seminar and probably the rest of the series, is the international development community has sought over the last few years to bring to bear two emergent conventional wisdoms. One is that programming needs to be a lot more political in various ways, and secondly, that reforming S&J, security and justice, particularly in fragile states, is very important. Has been progress in applying these, as I'll come to, but I'd say overall, practices remain quite immature, and that's what I'm really interested in, is the practical practice of doing this. And remind ourselves, I think, that this is actually very hard to do, so we shouldn't beat ourselves up too much. It is remarkably hard to do, but I think there are ways of doing it better. And in particular, if we avoid simplistic approaches, which sometimes is the case, and also if we really make much more effort to apply research on how policy and social change happen, we have a more impact. Okay, so this is how the talk is structured, if this machine works. Okay, now I will provide a little bit in terms of context, progress, and common problems, really to set the scene. I'm hoping that most people around the room, certainly the ones at the previous sessions that Lisa has had, will agree with much of what I've got in the first three sections, but again, if not, come back to that. So what I really want to focus on is how we apply emerging knowledge and tools, and I'll give you some examples of how we might do that. All right, the context, a couple of points on context. Again, I think what we're talking about here is bringing together these two emergent conventional wisdoms, political development and the rise and fall of SSR. Political development, getting politics into development. ODI has done a lot of good work on this. Tom Carruthers has done stuff on this. You're all hopefully familiar with the material that's been done. And as Tom's books lay out, I think it's very useful to think about this as thinking about politics as a goal. What we're trying to do here is bring about political change in some ways, but also politics as a method. and I'll touch on both, particularly politics as a method. And secondly, this emergent conventional wisdom about security and justice reform, SSR, rule of law, you can call it whatever you want with various different overlapping flavours. And my point here, why I've called it the fall and rise, is to remind ourselves, sitting in London, or to some extent working with DFID, is this wasn't invented by DFID in the 1990s. The particular iteration of security and justice, or SSR as it's called back in the 90s, arguably was invented by certain people working with DFID back in the 90s. But I always think it's useful to think back the longer history of this. And the shorter history, if you go back to the 1950s and 60s and look at modernization theory, a great deal of the work that development agencies and national security agencies did back in the 50s and 60s had elements of what we would now call security sector reform, security sector modernization. A lot of the work the US did in Latin America, Southeast Asia, indeed Africa, on police reform, for example, yes, it was carried out for national security reasons, to strengthen these states against communism, etc., etc. But a great deal of the content of what was done is quite similar to actually what we look at in police programs nowadays. So let's not think it was all invented in the 90s. And similarly, the much broader area of rule of law reform, including commercial law reform, it was much broader and is a lot longer standing than some of the more recent stuff on S&J. So popularity of aspects of security and justice reform has gone up and down over the years. And let's not think it's just about what was put down in the OECD papers and the DFID papers back in the 90s, the early 2000s. Unfortunately, I would say quite a lot of what has happened, though, in bringing these two together has led to theories of change and programming, which I think are quite absurd. And hopefully many of you will have had these experiences as well, unfortunately, where we end up with a program intervention, which is something like training police in whatever, equipping courts with IT systems, training judges, building forensics labs, as always a popular one. And the assumption in the program is that doing these things will fundamentally shift absolutely crucial power structures in that country, which is what this is about. How the police or security forces or the courts work in a country, it goes to the heart of the political economy of how relations are structured in the country. So many programs which actually assume that doing one of these fairly narrow technical interventions will have some impact on the fundamental politics of the country. We can sit around a table here and say that's obviously an absurd theory of change. I challenge you to look at programs that don't actually do that, even nowadays. So there's a big gap there, I think, between what we all recognize sitting around this table and what we actually do in practice. Going back to the fundamentals, I think, again, just setting the scene, I think it is quite useful to think about this again in a much longer historic context. When I give lectures occasionally on security sector reform, I usually start back with Peter the Great, because that's what I did for A-level. I'm sure it goes back further than that. But if you go back to attempts by countries to transpose modern security and justice sectors, you can at least go back to the 17th century. I know you can go back beyond that, when Peter the Great imported a lot of expertise from Europe. The Ottomans did the same in the 19th century. The Japanese did the same in the early 20th century. A lot of examples where states that felt they needed to quote-unquote modernize or develop, in the current jargon, imported security sector and justice expertise. They may not have been implementing it in many of the ways we talk about nowadays. There certainly wasn't much concept of human security or people-centered approaches, but a lot of the technical elements were the same. So I think it's worth going back to that because you can look at successes and failures of where that expertise was transposed. The other piece of context I think it's quite important to remember as a fundamental is if you just look at security and justice reform in OECD countries, just in the last 30 years, whether it's the US, France, Germany, the UK, it's always useful to remind ourselves just how difficult that's been. Just take three examples there. Police institutions. Read any of the literature on police reform, even in the States or the UK, and I think you quickly get an idea of how difficult it is to reform an institution like the police, how intractable certain institutions are to reform. So let's not be too ambitious. Oversight and accountability, again, buzzword, very sexy in all reform programs in developing countries we're looking at. Look at how we're struggling with that just in the UK, for those of you who are following police commissioners in the UK. Let alone gender issues. Those of you who work, let's say just with the police in the UK will realise how recent it is that we've actually effectively addressed gender issues in policing. In fact, we probably haven't fully. So I think it's important to remember there's a long history of transposition of securities expertise, of which we're purely at the tail end. We're a new twist on an old game, but also very important to remember how difficult it has been to reform these institutions in OECD countries. And much more generally, I think my point is what we're trying to do with S&J reform is massive, large-scale social change and behaviour change. Go back to the literature. Go back to Aaron Wildavsky on the top right, a very effective, famous American social scientist, political policy analyst, writing in the 70s, or the work of Paul Ormerod and others. There's a lot of really good literature out there which will point to you that even in much less controversial areas of public policy reform in OECD countries, it's remarkably difficult to actually mobilize the political and technical resources to bring about effective change. Go back to the case studies that some of these classic social scientists wrote about back in the 70s, back in the 90s, and you'll understand, I think, why it's so hard to bring about change in fairly simple programs, let alone the much more complex ones. So that's really a plea for being slightly cautious, less ambitious than we often are in the log frames that we all write and have all been guilty, I'm sure, of contributing to at one time or another. So getting down to the details then of security and justice reform and applying political approaches to it. Now, I would say, and I'm going to leave this open for debate afterwards, there have been relative successes, relative failures, and some in-betweens. You can argue over which category each of these countries falls into, and I won't allow that argument to go anywhere just yet. We can do that in debate afterwards. Just to draw out a couple of thoughts, though. Again, looking at the political aspects of security and justice reform. Where we have seen relative successes, East Europe, and I'd argue even the Balkans to some extent, some of you working on Kosovo may disagree with this, but there's relative successes, I think, in the Balkans at least. I think the political context of the relations with Europe and the domestic context have been particularly important there, of achieving some degree of successes. In contrast to countries like Pakistan, Central Asia, where in some cases equal amounts of technical assistance have been provided, or loan funding from some of the international financial institutions, but we've been much less successful at achieving any significant change in those security and justice institutions. And I think in places like Pakistan, Central Asia, and indeed some of the Middle Eastern countries, you see a much stronger set of vested interests and in fact a negative political economy, which has hampered and led to diversion of those technical and financial resources in many ways. And in many cases, particularly when you've seen security assistance programs in parts of Africa and Central Asia, in fact, a lot of the assistance has promoted repression and avoided reform. So I think there are some very basic political lessons to be learned from when reform can be effective that we can come back to. More importantly, though, what I wanted to come down to the details of how have we tried in the industry, if you like, to act more politically in S&J programs for the last 15 or so years. And I think there's been sort of four particular areas which I will then tease out in more detail a little bit later. I think on the one hand, we've tried to apply tools. So political economy analysis, stakeholder mapping, conflict analysis, etc. Governments and practitioners have tried to apply a range of tools to give themselves a better understanding of the political environment, the dynamics, the stakeholders, and then to shape programs around that. And there have been some successes, some failures in doing that. There have been a set of activities to engage more politically with stakeholders. And that's had varied aspects. On the one hand, there have been more attempts to integrate development activities with those of diplomats or spies in certain cases. So there's other parts of government that deal with more political aspects of countries. There have been attempts to engage more effectively with media, with demand side, and with communities, as well as with state institutions. So there have been a range of ways, and obviously with political parties as well. So there have been a range of ways in which programs have tried to engage politically through a number of different avenues and channels, and we'll come back to successes or failures. So it's been tools and approaches, I think, have been the key ways of doing it. Before moving on, I think it's useful just to highlight what I think are a few of the common delivery problems which any practical way forward needs to get over. And when I come to some practical ideas in a minute, I'll pick up on getting over some of these problems. So I would say there's four or five headline problems that I think we've encountered in trying to act more politically with S&J programs. Firstly, the quality of understanding. This isn't just a plea to be cleverer and understand the environment better, which is kind of the easy thing to say. But I think it is about really trying to get a deeper understanding of what these interventions are about and what the current situation is. My particular bugbear on this, come to policing, so many times I see us reaching for the solution of police. So many of these environments, we believe there is a policing issue, and there are various things that police structures are supposed to do, from community security, community safety, reassurance, investigations, etc., restorative justice, etc. So frequently, we do jump to a police solution. And I think most of you who worked in the field will know that usually that's the last thing that you actually want, but it tends to be the default position that we go for. So the quality of the understanding, I think, can often be limited. Secondly, templating. Many of you will have seen this, many of you probably will have done this, I'm sure I have as well. Simply taking a template and importing it from somewhere else. To some extent, beneficiaries often ask for this. If they're in state institutions, often they ask for this. They think that if they are a court, if they are a police force or a national security agency, that they should have something that looks like something that happens in a neighbouring country or a more developed country as they see it. So the templating isn't just imported by OECD donors, it is sometimes pulled in by those countries themselves. But nonetheless, it's a real issue, and we've had lots of cases, I think, where we assumed one thing will work somewhere and it's a completely different environment, so templating is a mistake. Quality of thinking is slightly different from quality of understanding. Quality of understanding is the deep analysis, real understanding of what the issues are, what the dynamics are. Quality of thinking, and this doesn't just apply to S&J, it applies to lots of parts of government activity, to be honest, and practitioner activity, is a real tendency to act rather than to think. Now, many might argue that academics and maybe NGOs at times spend too much time thinking, not acting. I know DFID is criticised sometimes for thinking rather than acting, and other parts of government like the Foreign Office and MOD don't like that. On the other hand, there's quite a tendency, I think, to spend the time and effort and the budget in acting rather than thinking. Now, there is a case in more complex situations for acting, thinking, and then acting again, so not doing all the thinking at the outset. But I would certainly say in my experience, most practitioners and policy people in bits of the donor agencies and governments find it much easier to act rather than to think, and spend much more time acting rather than thinking, which is an issue. And I must say, particularly in this area, it's not just in the S&J area, because it applies in other areas as well, of course, of development, there is quite an approach still which is quite reminiscent of what we thought we'd learned from the 50s and 60s. The approach to development in the 50s and 60s was partly about capital injection and loans, but a lot of it was this assumption that if you inject skills and expertise and raise the skills and knowledge of local communities and local actors and government institutions, that they would be able to move forward to the next stage of development. And in S&J, the last 20 years or so, I've still seen quite a lot of that, the assumption that if you uplift the skills of beneficiaries, they might be local elders in a jirga, there might be police officers, there might be prison officers, whatever it is, that is going to be enough to bring about a change. And I thought we moved away from that, but that's a real issue. It's a real issue. Quick word on this as a final problem, and I think it's an interesting issue. A lot has been written about this. Isomorphic mimicry now. And just for those of you who are not completely up with the latest or not very latest jargon, but the old jargon, basically the notion here that if something looks like something else, it may not behave like it. It's taken from biological sciences where a non-poisonous snake designs itself to look like a poisonous snake to scare off predators, etc. Exactly the same here. And the issue being that there's a tendency to create institutions or solutions that look like other ones but not realize they're completely different. So take a uniformed service, take a police or a military. If they have SOPs, standard operating procedures, if they have manuals, they have training courses, they have uniforms, they have command and control structures, they report to a parliament, the assumption is they actually behave a bit like, let's say, the British or the German police, even if you're in the Central African Republic or somewhere. Very easy sort of templating approach to take. And I think the literature now tells us that that is often seen as a substitute for change. In fact, it doesn't actually have the impact. There is more recent literature that's come out that makes the case, which I think is valid, that you shouldn't dismiss this. If a police force or a military or a court system does take on board certain norms of behaviour, certain systems and processes, there is a chance that it may actually over time begin to act in accordance with those norms and systems and processes. Because not to do so will create increasing cognitive dissonance between what it's supposed to do on paper and what it actually does in practice. So I think there is a value in creating these sort of isomorphic systems, but we shouldn't fool ourselves that they are. And I would say that in the business as a whole, there is a bit of a conspiracy there, natural conspiracy, between beneficiaries in a say a government institution, between donors and practitioners, to assume that an institution that looks like an institution is an institution. In many cases it's not, but there's a natural tendency to assume there is. So I think worth keeping an eye on that one. Okay, let me get to the point now of what you want to get to, which is so what? What do we do about this? Assuming you more or less agree on the thesis of where we are. I would say what we do about not fixing this, but slightly improving this, because we're not going to fix this, it's a big problem, slightly improving this, is we make better use of emerging knowledge and emerging tools. And I'll summarise what I think some of those are. I'll then give you an example of how some of my colleagues where I work now have tried to do this, and I'll come to some recommendations and then open up for debate and so on. So I think there's a set of emerging knowledge and emerging tools which is worth thinking through. And a lot of this at the headline level is nothing new, but I want to tease out a little bit what it really means. Okay, so there's a lot of buzz over the last decade or so about the application of complexity theory, or indeed chaos theory, some people would like us to have, to a whole range of public policy issues, including development, including to a very limited extent in S&J. Not much application in S&J, but certainly it's a subset of public policy. And a number of good writers on the topic, and so forth and so on. I think the point being, what we're trying to do here is get a better handle on how these systems work. They are complex systems, and that means something. It means if you change one thing in a system, it has several knock-on effects, and there are ways of beginning to model and understand how the system works. Without going into further details, I think applying complexity theory to a limited extent in these environments is valid, and there are ways in which it can be applied, and I'll come to some of that. Second point is about networks. Some programs, some practitioners, some analysts have begun to use social network analysis, for example, to do detailed stakeholder mapping that is applied to security and justice, and that's great. That's all very useful where it can be useful. The insights from network theory that I wanted to bring out there were slightly broader than that, and there's a couple of good authors on this recently, who make the case, if you look at public policy interventions more generally, and it could be anything, it could be healthcare reform, it could be early years education, it could be security and justice reform, it could be crime. Understanding how networks work in society is very powerful, and that's both positive and negative. The negative, because there are ways in which networks propagate negatively. In other words, you can have a negative effect that spreads throughout the network and is a very disruptive way. And in the environments we're working in, often that comes down to conflict dynamics. But also positively, if you look at examples of how networks can actually reinforce each other positively, you can have a much broader impact. And I'll come back to some practical applications of what might seem a bit theoretical in a minute. The third area is the whole very, very sexy area nowadays of behavioral economics. You've all read or heard of Nudge. You've all seen something of the work of the Behavioural Insights team at the Cabinet Office, which is trying to do everything from simplify your tax form to make you pay more taxes, to do various other things. Point being, there's a pseudoscience, possibly, put it that way now, of behavioural economics applied to public policy, some of which, in very small but significant ways, is beginning to have an impact where it's applied in the more stable environments of certainly European countries and the US. There are some very, very limited examples so far, I think, this is being applied in this domain, but it's a pseudoscience that I think, again, we need to draw on, and which can have more impact. And then finally, a whole range of quite solid social science areas where I think what I've seen, the application of this area has been partial, patchy and limited, useful in certain cases. We all talk about political economy. We talk about analysing the political marketplace. In certain cases, we've done that reasonably well in certain countries where we're applying S&J programs, but often I'd say it's not really internalised or not really integrated into the programming. Similar with conflict analyses. I'd be very interested to hear around the table if people can actually point to me to more than one or two cases in programs that they've worked on, advised on, and be engaged in, where you've actually had real mainstreaming of political economy or conflict analyses into your S&J programs. There's a very small number of cases I would suggest where that happens. And the anthropology of sociology of power, which is what it's really about. Again, where I'm currently mainly focused at the moment on the Middle East and South Asia. There's a little bit of work on this, looking at the political economy of power, of how repression works in post-authoritarian or patronage-based states, but it's limited, and the application of that to programming or interventions is again quite limited. So it's a question of really sponsoring that research and doing something useful with it. So emerging knowledge, I think we can draw on, and then turning that into tools. The 5 I think are worth thinking about. By integrated approach, I mean that in the way that UK government used to talk about comprehensive approach. It's basically bringing together all the aspects. In a development sense, it's not necessarily all the aspects as in Foreign Office, MOD and DFID. It's integrating political engagement, public financial management, civil society, private sector, and the S&J aspects. And again, I'm amazed how infrequently, for example, parliamentary reform or PFM is integrated with S&J programming. Fairly simple thing to do. Secondly, campaign design. And again, I mean that really in terms of the campaign approach, how you're actually trying to shift the behaviours of the target audience in that very campaigning way. And that's a set of tools that we need to use a lot more of. Analytical tools I've talked about. System dynamic modelling, not really applied very much in this domain. But again, there is potential there to do a lot more effective work actually trying to model how these dynamic systems work and then shape interventions around those. We can come back to that possibly when we have time. The whole adaptive management piece, PDIA, probe sensor response, there's various different pieces of jargon for adaptive management nowadays. But again, particularly applying our programs to complex environments is where we need to take some of those approaches. Now, let me just give you now, if you don't mind, a couple more minutes. I'll give you a very quick example of how some of my colleagues where I work now have tried to apply some of these thoughts. I'll only have a couple of minutes. I'll just hit a couple of headlines and happy to discuss in more detail later because I want to go on to recommendations to get the debate, really going. So it's quite a complex model, but probably best if I sort of, just let you read it offline and come back to me. This is a model that some of my colleagues, particularly Alex Martin, some of you know, who works with me in my other job in Actis and the company, have tried to develop, where he's tried to develop a model of how security and justice sector institutions work. And in 2 minutes, I'm not going to run through the whole thing, but the basic idea is that to have any institution functioning effectively to deliver security and justice, we need to align a number of things. You need to align capabilities, which is what we mainly focus on in many of these programs, incentives, why should people change their behavior, and politics. So any effective program needs to align those, not just focus on one of those, and that security and justice outcomes for the public, i.e. the beneficiaries we put at the middle of this, don't come from just one institution, a police force or a court system or a prison system or whatever. They come from a range of different organizations operating through a network. So it's understanding how the network works rather than the individual institutions work. So what that means in practice is that to understand how the public receive benefits, in this case security and justice benefits, which you'll get at the top end of any log frame that any of you have worked with, what you need to do is understand what the public expect from their providers, understand how the network works together to provide these, understand then how the organizations function, which is the more classic part of institutional analysis, and then understand how the organizations provide the services, and by understanding both their capabilities, do they have trained police, do they have SOPs, but more importantly, do they have incentives? should they change their behaviour in doing this. The key then, when you go into any organisation and break up the organisation in different ways, is to look at the capabilities and incentives. And I'm almost done here, because the incentives piece is where the politics comes in. And so much of our work is around capabilities that affecting the incentives is the key part of this. I won't go through the rest of it then, but the key really is then to come up with ways to think about programs which allow us to assess how the capabilities and incentives work in an organisation, and then design interventions that shape those. And then, crucially, particularly when you're looking at public sector officials in a defence ministry or a justice ministry or a chief justice, to give them the tools to engage with the public to make decisions about that. We'll come back to that later. So my last couple of minutes, where might we want to go in terms of doing this better? Some points here for donors, and I think the key points I'll bring out here is that we are still stuck in this trap of unrealistic expectations, and we have to, of course, be unrealistic to get the funding, to persuade decision makers this is worth doing. If we point out to decision makers how difficult this is, chances are we won't get the funding, and those branches of DFID will be closed down, or USAID will be closed down, and many of us will be out of business. So on the one hand, there's a conspiracy there of exaggerated expectations, but the more honesty we can have about timescale and goals, the better. The integrated approach, I would say. And then the other two elements, I think, for donors, and this is a real problem for DFID at the moment. This isn't a DFID bashing session like the last one you had. But the issue for DFID at the moment, obviously, is trying to get lots of money out of the door quickly. But in fact, these programs are about small-scale strategic intervention to shape incentives rather than deliver lots of capability. And that doesn't necessarily fit with the model of large-scale programming. And then this solid analysis and monitoring, which isn't just programmatic monitoring, but real understanding of incentives and structures are crucial. For practitioners and implementers and researchers, many of you around this room, I think these are the four interesting things. This question of understanding, monitoring, and shaping incentives. I see S&J programs, frankly, as about, this is what they're about. They're about shifting a political calculus by those who hold power and resources in many of these countries. That's what they're about. And that's really what they should be bringing about. Everything else should be targeted to doing that. How we do that, how we measure that, then we can come back to. Naturally, there is a tendency, that's just the way the system works, to race to a results bottom line. There will be a conspiracy amongst everybody, a genuine conspiracy, amongst beneficiaries, amongst donor agencies and implementers, to choose nice, simple results everybody can sign off on and everybody can claim success. That's not what programs should be about. They should be about shifting incentives, political incentives. Much harder to measure, much harder to deliver on if you're an official or an implementer. And I think the final point there, understanding how causation and correlation work. There's a really interesting debate, which maybe we can have a little bit now. The whole attempt nowadays to do better evidence-based programming, put us all through the pain of theories of change, etc., is on the assumption that we can actually draw out causality. We can understand causality. In many cases, even if you're trying to do domestic policy in the UK environment, a much more controlled environment, we don't actually understand causality. We're not quite sure how causality works. So we need to be quite careful assuming that we can actually draw out these causal chains without much more trial and adaptation. There is a case for saying that we look at correlation. In many of these cases, particularly now that we have a lot more data available, particularly in the middle-income countries and even some of the lower-income countries, that correlation might be enough. That if we can simply show that a certain set of interventions over time correlates with certain outcomes, that might be enough without assuming we have to really understand causality. Controversial to the theory of change high priests, but I think we might have to go for that at times. So hopefully, sorry, I had to run through some of the detail quickly, but hopefully it set the scene a bit for the debate and a few points there that we can debate.
Great, thank you.